today Jeffrey Ezell from, tell us exactly what Department of Public Works you are.
It's a division of Public Works called Metro Beautification and Environment Commission.
I want to thank Jeffrey for being here today, and interested in hearing what you've got to tell us about composting. Take some of the mystery out of it.
Thank you, David. Welcome everybody. My name is Jeffrey Ezell. As I said, I work for Metro Beautification, which is a division of Metro Public Works. One of the main things that we do is try and provide education programs like this one, because composting and recycling and other sorts of responsible waste management tactics are really good for the city as well as being good for other reasons, like being very beneficial for the soil, which is, I would imagine, why most of you are here today. Now, if anybody has any questions at any point, just feel free to shout it out, or if you have any comments or anything. If you've been composting for a while and are just here to sort of brush up or hear some sort of basic pointers and tips, things like that, feel free to add any personal anecdotes or anything like that if you'd like, because some of you may have more hands-on experience with this than I do, so feel free to add in. Now, composting is important, and I don't know how well everybody can see this chart, but this chart shows the breakdown of the average waste stream of homes in North America. Now, I don't know how much time you've spent thinking about the breakdown of the trash that leaves your house, but somewhere around 11% of the average household waste is all food waste, and another 12 to 13% of that is all yard waste, which is a very big percentage. It's almost a quarter of all the waste that's coming out of the homes in North America. It's really easily compostable. And of course, as you can see, a lot of these other sorts of things, almost 40% of that is clean, dry, recyclable fiber products like paper and cardboard, which are really easy things to recycle. But we'll talk about all the recycling either later or at another date. Now, before we get to this, the reason that it's important for the city and everybody that lives in Davidson County and Middle Tennessee to practice responsible waste management, at least from our perspective, is that the city actually doesn't have a landfill anymore for what we call municipal solid waste. Now, that includes all of the regular trash that comes from all the houses, stores, restaurants, hospitals, except for medical waste, of course. But it includes all of the trash that comes out of all these sorts of places. And we don't have a landfill like that anymore. Now, we used to have one that closed down in 2002, which was off of County Hospital Road. They shut down that landfill because one of the main reasons was that nobody really wants to live right next to a landfill. And it got very political and that got shut down, but that's another story for another day. The reason why this is important is that the city has to pay just over $31 for every ton of garbage that goes into a landfill. So all of the trash from Davidson County actually ends up at a landfill just outside of Murfreesboro called Middle Point. And it's operated by a private company. It's Allied Waste. And last year that amounted to over $5 million that we spent just getting rid of trash, which is a lot of money. And if you think about the 23% of our food waste and yard waste, if we were composting all of that stuff, then that would make a huge difference in the amount of money that the city would bring in and would eliminate need for a wider tax base, at least on some level. Now, I'd imagine another reason why it's important to all of you is because composting, through a managed decomposition of our food and yard waste, creates a good free fertilizer or soil amendment for your yard or garden. We're going to talk about some ways to sort of speed along that process and make it so you don't just pile everything up, and unless you want to, and you can speed up that process of creating fertile soil or fertilizer to add to your yard or garden. Now, what we basically want to do is, in the process of composting, is create a sort of a buffet line for all of these, what we call decomposers. Now, a lot of these things, the vast majority of them are going to be microscopic, things that we can't see, bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, other sorts of little critters that are going to be crawling around in the dirt and in your compost pile that help break all of this stuff down and turn it into that really good soil that we want to create. Now, you have larger decomposers as well, like worms and beetles and other sorts of things that we can see that might be able to make it into your compost pile and help break down that stuff faster as well. Some larvae and other sorts of things might get in there, and they can do a really good job of converting your food waste and yard waste into compost really, really well and very quickly. Now, all of these decomposers that we'll be counting on, all the bacteria and larger things, a lot of them need the exact same things that we do. Okay, they need food, they need water, and they need air. Now, the food that we're going to be giving them is, a lot of that is going to be the food waste and yard waste that goes in there. And we will refer to those as, there are a couple different types that we want to add together to help expedite this process. And we will refer to the yard waste as browns. These are really carbon-rich materials that a lot of these decomposers need to create energy. We would also ideally be creating or adding what we're referred to as greens. Now, these are really nitrogen-rich things. These will include all of the food waste that you have, primarily fresh fruits and vegetables and other sorts of things. There are other things that you can compost other than fruits and vegetables. You can compost anything really that was once living, any sort of plant or animal. But if you're composting in your backyard and you have that's all you're composting is your own personal food and yard waste, it's going to be difficult to compost things like meat, large amounts of fat or grease, or bones, things like that. These just create more problems for people composting than other types of things, so I generally don't advise people to try and compost large amounts of dairy products or meat or bones if they're going to be doing it in their backyard. Now, if you have a really big compost pile, or if there's a municipal compost facility or something like that, they can compost anything. They can compost all the meat, cheese, baked goods, anything like that, except the heat generated, the heat needed to convert all of that stuff to soil in a quick manner is generally not going to be reached in a backyard style compost pile. All of those decomposers that we saw in the previous slide, the reason that we refer to backyard composting, if you manage your compost pile appropriately, and we'll talk more about that, it actually, all of their body heat creates a large amount of heat. So a lot of people will refer to that as thermal composting, because when you actively manage your compost pile, it can reach temperatures like we were talking about earlier of 140, 150, and even in some cases 160 degrees Fahrenheit. I also said that these decomposers need air and water. In your compost pile, you want to make sure that it doesn't get too dry or too wet if you want for this to go really, really smoothly, or ideally. You want to try and manage the moisture levels in your compost pile just by poking a few holes in it, make sure that a little bit of air can get in there and it doesn't get really soggy and get really, really matted down. So like after a rainstorm or something like that, if your compost pile isn't covered, you might want to just sort of poke a bunch of holes in your compost pile and keep the air content in there. Instead of having everything get really, really matted down, you want to try and keep some air in there. That'll be good for a couple different sorts of things. It'll help speed up the process of composting, but it'll also help keep the right decomposers in there. If it does get really, really soggy, some of the bacteria that'll get in there, those are the ones that, the anaerobic bacteria usually are the ones that might create unideal odors, we shall say. Now, how hard is composting? Like I mentioned earlier, if you're going to do a compost pile, there are lots of different ways of composting. If you want to just have a pile and let everything break down on its own, you can continuously add things to that pile. We call that static composting because it just sort of sits there and then works itself. It's perfectly fine. It'll generally just take a lot longer, but it requires, the only effort that it requires is throwing all of your materials into that pile. And it's the sort of tree in the forest type composting that tree will become soil and add itself to all of the really rich, fertile forest soil. But it's going to take a really, really long time for that to entirely break down. Now, if you spend a little bit of time after adding your food and yard waste to your compost pile, spend a little bit of time checking the moisture levels and checking the temperature of your pile. That'll help to speed up the process, like I mentioned earlier. Now, I've talked some about this, but the two main types of composting that people will generally use in their backyard are piles and batches. Now, some people will talk about one being better than the other. It just sort of depends upon what's right for you. Now, this is a picture of an open pile. I'm sure, I guess y'all have at least an open pile. You said that you're also using a tumbler. So we'll talk about one of those in a little bit. I'm sure everybody's seen an open pile at a friend's house or a family member's house or something like that. This is generally if you just throw all your food and yard waste into one big pile and let it hang out for a while and see what happens. Contained pile, something like this, or if you use a tumbler or a batch composting method, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. Now, there are a number of different ways of doing contained piles. I'm sure that you've all seen various compost bins that are available at retail stores. This compost bin that we have a picture of on the left, it's called the Earth Machine. It's an 80-gallon capacity black plastic compost bin. It's very simple, and the reason it's good is because it keeps all of your compostables together. It doesn't have big holes. It's not really open to the environment, so it also helps to keep out potential critters and other sorts of things like that. It also helps to keep out a lot of the rain and other sorts of things that would otherwise, mat down your pile and make it sort of a big sloshy situation. If you don't want to buy a retail compost bin or anything like that, lots of folks have really good success building compost piles or a compost bin with either like 3 walls. People will turn pallets up vertically and use those to contain all of your compostables. Some people will use chicken wire, like you can see in here. It's really just anything that you can think of that would help keep all of your things together. Because when you have everything together in a column or in a cube sort of shape, all of that stuff is it's gonna speed up the composting process very nicely. Now, this is a example of what we call a batch composter. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the tumblers and other sorts of things, or used one maybe. Tumblers are great because they can turn all of your compostables into compost really, really quickly. A lot of them advertise that they can do it in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. What sort of success have you had with your tumbler?
Mine's more like 4 to 6 weeks. But
More like 4 to 6 weeks?
I don't think I'm in as sunny a location. I have a lot of large trees. It probably would be more optimal if I were in full sun with it.
Gotcha. And I'm sure that they advertise that.
Oh, yeah. one day.
Give you sort of one end of the spectrum.
Food, the next day compost. Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, it would appear to me that a batch composter, you really need about 3 of them, so you can have one that you're working out of, one that's in the process, and one that you're just beginning to load, because it's more like 6 weeks in reality.
I don't think they're worth a dime. I wouldn't waste my money.
Yeah, because a lot of them, they
Larry
can get,
did. You're too late.
they can get pretty expensive.
I got one too, bro. You almost would need to get it to work right. You'd almost need to collect for a while, for a typical house, right? So so you're actually putting enough compostable materials in it that it'll work. Or
yeah, you would ideally want to collect your food waste for at least probably 2 weeks before you put it in
how
there.
full would you want it?
That's a really good question, and I don't think that it would matter too much. I would think that if you had the thing half full, you want to have enough in there so you have air in the system. You don't want it to be really, really jam-packed. I would think that if you filled it up halfway, that would make things a lot easier, because you'd have enough stuff in there to heat up pretty nicely, but not so much that you're sort of crowding out all the oxygen and other sorts of things that you want to be able to get in there as well. and
And also
feed
gets
the
hard to turn
decomposer.
when you get more than that.
Yeah, I was about to say that as well.
And how often should it be turned?
You're going to want to turn those probably every 2 or 3 days. It's the same sort of method as if you have a contained pile, whether it's something with chicken wire, or if you have build like 3-walled cinder blocks, or you use pallets. Pallets are a good thing because that'll also help keep the airflow going in your compost pile. You're going to want to make sure that there's air in that system every 3 or 4 days, probably 3 days. There are other ways of keeping air in your pile as opposed to stirring it or poking lots and lots of holes in it. Some people, if you're going to have a big pile, like if you take 3 pallets and make a 3-walled or 4-walled sort of containment system, some people will take a PVC pipe and drill a few holes in it and stand it vertically in the middle of their pile and just leave the top open. So that will feed air into the middle of the compost pile. Some people will even go so far as to run, if you do use pallets, you could run pipes through horizontally. You could run pipes through the boards on a pallet and keep air going through that way, which seems to work pretty well as well. Where do you want to put a compost bin? Ideally, not too far from wherever you're going to be generating your food waste. If you have a lot of property and you put it really far away, unless you really enjoy walking, it's going to be a little bit harder to take your food waste out there every 2, 3, 4 days, or however you like to collect your food waste if you're going to be adding it in there. I just try and encourage people not to put it so far away that they're not going to make it there in January if they want to be doing this year-round. You want to add your food and cover it up with brown materials like dried leaves. Now, anything that the smaller the pieces are, the quicker they're going to break down. Okay. And every time you go out there and add food, if it's every 2 or 3 days or if it's every week, you want to just cover all of that stuff up with your brown materials, whether it's dried leaves or newspapers or whatever. If you're going to use newspapers for that, I should have mentioned earlier, you're going to want to shred all of that stuff up. And if you have really, really big leaves, if you can mulch them or something before you put them in your compost pile, that'll help out a lot as well, because if the pile gets really wet, all of those things will mat down and sort of stick together, and then newspapers especially and large leaves will create a layer that you don't want in your compost pile, because any more moisture that wants to get in there, good moisture, it'll just sort of run off to the sides and it'll sort of obstruct your decomposers from getting around, and it'll slow things down. Whether it's an open pile or a contained pile or however you're doing it, you want to add your food and cover it up with brown materials like dried leaves. Now, anything that the smaller the pieces are, the quicker they're going to break down. Okay. And every time you go out there and add food, if it's every 2 or 3 days or if it's every week, you want to just cover all of that stuff up with your brown materials, whether it's dried leaves or newspapers or whatever. If you're going to use newspapers for that, I should have mentioned earlier, you're going to want to shred all of that stuff up. And if you have really, really big leaves, if you can mulch them or something before you put them in your compost pile, that'll help out a lot as well, because if the pile gets really wet, all of those things will mat down and sort of stick together, and then newspapers especially and large leaves will create a layer that you don't want in your compost pile, because any more moisture that wants to get in there, good moisture, it'll just sort of run off to the sides and it'll sort of obstruct your decomposers from getting around, and it'll slow things down. Then basically all that's really left to do is monitor your pile. Now, we talked about moisture levels. Ideally, your compost pile would be about as wet as a wrung-out sponge. Sort of damp, but not overly wet or anything like that. If your pile does get rained on and it's really soggy, if you just go out there, like I mentioned, and poke a bunch of holes in it, kind of fluff it up a little bit, it should be fine. If your pile starts to smell, try the same thing. Add a little bit of air to that system, and it should take care of that within a day or two. After you stir up your pile, add oxygen to it, and poke a few holes or stir it up a little bit if you can. You might notice temperature spikes because of all the decomposers in there. Like I mentioned earlier, all their body heat generates a large amount of heat in your compost pile. And if you stir your pile and pay really close attention to it every few days, you can get temperature spikes every 3 or 4 days when you do that. And now these temperatures might reach up to 140 or 150 degrees. Not if you go stir up your pile and you don't get a temperature spike, then either it's time to stir it up again, or if that doesn't work, then you might be finished. Actually, your compost might be ready. That's one of the indicators that you're not getting temperature spikes.
May I ask you, what kind of thermometer do you recommend using?
There is a thermometer that is available through Metro. We just sell them at cost. They're $10 right now. It's a 20-inch long thermometer that's made by Rayotemp, and the Earth Machine compost bin that we sell, you can just sort of slide it in one of the little air slits on the side, and they work pretty well. How do you know when you're finished? If your temperature stops fluctuating after you stir up your compost pile, that's one indicator that you might be finished. If you're going to want to check out what your compost looks like. If you reach in there, it sounds like a lot of you have been composting before. If you look in there and there's banana peel sitting right there, it's not finished. So there's something else that you need to do to keep that going, to keep it breaking down. If it smells like anything other than rich, fertile soil, then it's probably not finished. Okay. There are a couple of ways to test out smell if you really want to get serious about it and make sure that everything's broken down and mature compost. If you take a handful of whatever you got, you think it might be finished, and put it in a big jar, like a 16-ounce jar or so, and fill it up with halfway with water, 2/3 of the way with water, and seal it. Okay, and then come back 24 hours later, and you'll know. The smell will be there if it's not ready yet. The test works really well. If it smells just innocuous or neutral, or if it smells like just like dirt or soil, then you'll be fine. If it smells really, really terrible, then your pile's still got a little ways to go. So it's a pretty good test as well. Now, depending upon what you put in your compost pile, you might get different sorts of things. If you put in lots of sticks and twigs and you're going to be composting your brush, you might get something that comes out looking a lot more like mulch than if it's all fruits and vegetables and dried leaves. Then that stuff's going to coming more like potting soil or something like that. Now, there are other types of compost bins as well. There's an infinite amount of compost bins that are available at a lot of different places. Metro sells that black plastic compost bin that I was talking about earlier, called the Earth Machine. We just sell that to have something available to the public because we like to encourage people to compost in their backyards, like we mentioned earlier. Another thing that we offer that is even a little bit easier but a lot different, it's called the Green Cone. It's a digester. So it's a lot like a compost bin, but it's a little bit different. You can add different sorts of things. You can put in any sort of food that you want. Okay, like it says up here, you can put in meat, fat, bones. These things really work so well that you can't actually fill them up. It'll just get rid of all of your food waste. This is the type, you can put in baked goods and cheese or yogurt, whatever you want to put in there, except for yard waste or a bunch of manure or something like that, and it'll get rid of it. Do what?
How big is that?
That's a good question. Because I said you can't fill it up. It might be 50 feet tall, right? The thing is, that's a good question. The black base right there is about probably 2 feet in diameter, 2.5 feet in diameter. And what you do is you would bury that black plastic base in the soil, and then put this green plastic cone just on top of it, and bury it sort of up to the lip at the base of the green part. And there's a 2-layered cone that goes on top. On the inside is a black plastic cone, and then the green plastic cone, there's about probably 3/4 of an inch of air in between the black plastic cone and the green plastic cone, so it can trap heat and keep everything nicely insulated to help keep breaking those things down. Now, having the base underground like that invites in lots of bacteria, worms, and other sorts of things. The openings aren't large enough to encourage moles and other sorts of things like that, but these things do a really, really good job of breaking down all your food waste. But it's not the sort of thing where you want to put in brush or lots of yard waste and grass clippings and things like that.
So when it's finished though, there's no compost, it's just.
That's the difference between a compost bin and this, is everything just gets sort of
Sludge.
spread out and dissipated into your yard. Sort of, this is the illustration that they give, sort of illustrate how it works. That's one thing that people don't like about it, is that you don't have compost that you can then spread around and use in your garden or around your yard or anything like that.
It's a good way to get rid of bacon grease anyway.
Yeah, it's good way to get rid of bacon grease. And there's no openings except for at the very top of the cone, so there's no way for animals to get at your things or other things like that.
How about smell from it?
Nothing. Now, there's a lid at the top where all your food waste goes in, but there's no air holes, there's no nothing. So when you put the lid on top, it fits pretty snugly on top, and there's no smell that comes out of it. I mean, if you take off the lid and
Grease, bones.
stick your head down in the opening,
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be able to smell it, probably. But you're not going to be hanging around doing that anyway, I would imagine.
Yeah, so
But I mean, if you could put it right next to your kitchen, it'd be fine.
So literally everything we've been told not to put in compost, you can put in this.
That's the great thing about this,
So you
is
can
how
get rid
easy
of it.
they are. You walk out there with your food waste in whatever sort of bucket that you have, dump it in there, put the lid back on, and leave. That's it. But now Metro, I mentioned, has a facility at the Omohundro Recycling Convenience Center. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's on Omohundro Drive. It's right off of Lebanon Road, about 2 or 3 miles southeast of downtown. We have 10 different types of compost bins out there that are available to sort of check out, see how they operate, those sorts of things. The only ones that we actually sell out there are the Earth Machine and the Green Cone. But they have the tumbler and they have other sorts of compost bins out there that you can check out and see sort of which one you like, which one might be for you. They also have these old compost kitchen collection buckets, which are pretty nice, but really you can get a kitchen collection bucket from just about anywhere. If you drink coffee, what I use at home is one of those big Maxwell House plastic coffee cans. It's got the snap-on lid. That's important because you don't want to attract fruit flies or anything like that in your house. You really just want to have something, anything with a lid and a handle really is a good compost kitchen collection thing. If anybody's got a really excellent idea for something like that, I'm sure somebody might like to hear about it, but that's really the important thing. So we offer the Earth Machine, the Green Cone, the collection bucket, and a little stir type thing. If anybody's ever interested in where you can get certain things like that. I also, my compoker that I use to keep air in my system is just an old broomstick. I mean, you can use just about anything. Ski pole that you probably don't want to use for skiing anymore. Broomstick, rake, whatever you got, a dowel.
You don't want to, like you wouldn't, a pitchfork, you just wouldn't want to turn it that much?
A pitchfork is great. And if you do want to actually turn your pile, I don't want to discourage anybody from that because it's a really good way to keep things mixed up, keep a lot of air in the system, and keep
Good
things working
exercise,
on
too.
really nicely. And it's really good exercise. But the reason
into
that
that kind of thing.
the reason I don't tell people that's what they need to do is because that's one thing that turns people off is they picture themselves out there like just sweating bullets.
Well, I want to see what he's doing.
Composting rules.
I thought that's what you were supposed to do.
That's what a lot of people.
Bullets, man.
Yeah, sweat bullets. It helps. It's a good activator.
Where else do y'all, as Metro, where else do you encourage people to do this? Like,
We're currently working on a pilot program for a municipal compost facility where we would collect food waste from grocery stores and other sorts of places like that that have large amounts of produce or yard waste. So that's in the works as far as food waste goes. All of the yard waste that we collect from those sorts of things, all of the dried leaves and yard waste, they go to the mulch facility that we have, and they turn all of those leaves into compost that you can go pick up when it's available, and they turn all that brush and low caliber trees and other sorts of things. into
Anybody
mulch.
can go there and get compost from it?
Yeah, it's all leaves though. There's no food waste or anything like that that's gone in there. If you've got a bunch of brush, or if you have a landscaping company or something like that, you can take all that brush to the mulch facility. It's located at 1400 County Hospital Road. You can take all your brush over there, and I think they will charge you a penny a pound to take it, which is almost free. Very shortly, actually. Does anybody have any other questions? Or
How do you say your last name?
Ezell.
Ezell.
Just like the road.
Just like the road.
What I was asking really was how's the idea of composting and all this information that Metro has, how are regular people in their neighborhoods finding out about it? What's encouraging them to do this?
Website, mostly.
So how do they even know to go to the website?
That's a good question. If you have cable and you have channel Metro 3, you might see it there. We really just don't have much of a budget for advertising much of this stuff. Now, when the when the food waste composting project gets going a little bit better, that'll be on Metro 3 a lot, and I'm sure it'll be in the newspaper and be on the news. Every now and then there are news plugs about it.
For your radio show.
Channel 4, Channel 5, and they do things like that, but they just can't do it all the time because we don't have enough money to pay anybody to do it. I've also got my information up there. If anybody ever has questions or anything like that in the future, feel free to contact me, or if you want to see if there's compost at the facility on County Hospital Road, I'd be more than happy to help you out with those sorts of things. If you have questions about how to get to the Omaha Grow Recycling Convenience Center, please feel free to let me know.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
You're very welcome.
You got some giveaways up there, right?
Yeah, I brought some little sorts of things, just things that I had with me. I brought a couple of these pocket ashtrays that we give out. We get from Keep America Beautiful. These you can keep in your pocket, stick your butts in there, so you won't be tempted to throw them on the ground if anybody would be interested in one of these sorts of things. We have this
There's
one.
some friends I give them to.
And then there's also this sort of style, which is a little bit better. A little bit fancier, I guess. So I've got a few of these if anybody wants one of those. These are pretty sturdy, and they keep the scent in, keep your pocket from smelling like a cigarette butt. Keep the cigarette butts off the ground, which is important as well.
Thank you very much.